The Galactic Empire of the had ruled over 2,000 star systems for nearly 8,000 years. They were old when humans still lived in caves and hunted animals with sticks. Their bodies were covered in thick green scales, and they stood almost 8 feet tall. Their eyes were like those of insects, made of hundreds of tiny lenses that saw everything at once. They moved slowly, spoke slowly, and thought in terms of centuries rather than years. To them, humans were nothing more than insects who had somehow learned to build starships. General Laura stood alone at the observation deck of the diplomatic station called Horizon's Edge. She watched the warships drift past the windows like giant metal whales swimming through the darkness of space. Each ship was bigger than a small city, covered in weapons that could burn entire planets to ash. She had counted 12 of them so far, and more were arriving every hour. Laura was 63 years old. Her hair had turned gray many years ago, and she kept it pulled back in a tight bun the way military regulations required. Her face was lined with wrinkles, each one earned through decades of service to humanity. She had spent 40 years of her life making sure humans never had to fight the again. 40 years of smiling at creatures who looked at her species the way humans looked at ants. The Treaty of Rest had been signed 500 years ago, after the First Contact War. That war had been a disaster for humanity. They had better ships, better weapons, and millions of years of experience in conquest. Humans had fought bravely, but bravery was not enough against an enemy who could destroy stars. When the war ended, humanity had lost 12 colony worlds. They were forced to pay tribute every year, sending resources and technology to the Empire. They were forbidden from building large military fleets or expanding beyond a small corner of the galaxy called the Orion Arm. But the treaty also meant peace, 500 years without war, 500 years for humanity to grow, to rebuild, to learn. The thought humans were using that time to accept their place as a lesser species. They were wrong. The door behind Laura opened with a soft hiss. She turned to see Lieutenant Price walking toward her. He was young, barely 30, with the eager look of someone who still believed the universe was fair. He carried it in his hands. "General," he said, "the delegation has arrived. High Arbiter is asking for an immediate meeting." Laura looked back at the warships outside the window, asking or demanding. Hesitated. "You know how they are, ma'am." She did know. That was exactly what worried her. This summit had been called to discuss the tribute payments. Humanity had grown wealthy over the past few centuries, and they wanted a bigger share. It was supposed to be a routine negotiation, the kind of humiliation humans had endured many times before. Laura had attended 6 of these summits during her career. Each time, she had smiled and nodded while they reminded humanity how lucky they were to be allowed to exist. But something felt wrong this time. They had brought too many ships. High Arbiter was known as one of the most dangerous leaders in the Empire, a creature who still remembered the First Contact War and hated that humans had survived it. He had publicly called for stricter controls on human expansion. Some said he wanted to finish what the war had started. Laura followed through the corridors of the station toward the negotiation chamber. Horizon's Edge was neutral territory, built specifically for meetings between humans and the Empire. The walls were painted in soft colors meant to calm the mind. The air was kept at a temperature comfortable for both species. Everything about the station was designed to encourage peaceful discussion. Laura had never trusted it. Peace built on weakness was not really peace. It was just a pause before the next attack. The negotiation chamber was a large circular room with a high ceiling and windows that looked out at the stars. A long table sat in the center, with chairs designed for human bodies on one side and larger seats built for on the other. Laura took her place at the head of the human delegation. Beside her sat Ambassador Richard Cole, a career diplomat who had spent his whole life learning customs and language. Behind them stood a small group of aides and advisors, all carefully chosen for their ability to stay calm under pressure. They entered a moment later. High Arbiter led them, his massive body moving with the slow grace of a predator who knew he had nothing to fear. His scales were darker than most of his kind, almost black in places, and his compound eyes reflected the light like polished stones. He wore robes of deep purple, the color of royalty, decorated with golden symbols that told the story of his victories. Behind him came 6 advisors and 4 guards. The guards carried weapons that looked ceremonial but were actually quite deadly. Laura knew this because she had studied military equipment for decades. She knew their strengths and their weaknesses. She knew things about them that they did not know she knew. Settled into his seat and fixed his eyes on Laura. When he spoke, his voice was a series of clicks and hisses that his translator device converted into flat, emotionless English. "General, we have reviewed your proposal for tribute reduction. It is rejected." Laura kept her face calm. This was expected. They always started negotiations by rejecting everything. It was their way of establishing dominance. "Perhaps we could discuss the economic data," she said. "Our current tribute levels are putting serious strain on human colonies. We are not asking for charity, merely a reasonable adjustment based on our actual capabilities." "Reasonable" made a sound that might have been laughter. "Your species speaks of reason while breeding like insects across the stars. You spread and multiply without control. The Empire's patience has limits, General." Ambassador Cole leaned forward. "High Arbiter, the treaty specifically protects humanity's right to expand within our designated boundaries. We have followed every rule." "Rules can change," said. "Treaties can be amended. Nothing is permanent, Ambassador. Your species should understand this better than most. You live such short lives." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his voice, a certainty that went beyond normal arrogance. He was not here to negotiate. He was here for something else entirely. "What exactly are you proposing, High Arbiter?" she asked. His compound eyes seemed to gleam. "We will discuss that in time, General. For now, let us continue with the formalities. The Empire has prepared a list of new demands. You will find them quite comprehensive." He gestured to one of his advisors, who placed it on the table and slid it toward the human delegation. Laura picked it up and began to read. With each line, her heart sank a little lower. The demands were not just harsh. They were impossible. Tripled tribute payments, surrender of 3 more colony worlds, permanent military bases in human space, restrictions on human scientific research. These were not terms for peace. These were terms for surrender. Laura looked up from and Met's eyes. In that moment, she understood exactly what was happening. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to deliver an ultimatum. And when humanity refused, as they knew humanity would refuse, the Empire would have its excuse for war. 500 years of peace were about to end, and there was nothing Laura could do to stop it. The negotiations continued for 3 more days, and each day was worse than the one before. They demanded more and offered nothing in return. Every time the human delegation tried to find middle ground, pushed them further back. It was like trying to bargain with a stone wall that kept moving closer and closer. Laura spent her nights studying the situation from every angle. She barely slept. Her mind kept returning to the same dark conclusion. This summit was never meant to succeed. They were looking for a reason to restart the war, and they would create one if they had to. On the morning of the 4th day, she received an encrypted message from Admiral Hayes. He commanded the human fleet stationed 3 star systems away, a small collection of ships that existed only because the treaty allowed humanity to maintain a token defense force. Was an old friend. They had served together for 30 years, and Laura trusted him more than anyone else in the military. The message was short and terrifying. "Laura, our intelligence people intercepted communications. They decoded enough to understand the basic plan. Has orders from the Empire's ruling council. He is supposed to create an incident at the summit, something that will give them an excuse to void the treaty. They want to crush humanity before we grow any stronger. Be careful. Trust no one." Laura read the message 3 times, then deleted it from her. She had suspected something like this, but seeing it confirmed made her stomach turn. They were planning to murder the peace that had lasted 5 centuries, and she was standing right in the middle of their trap. She thought about warning the rest of the delegation, but decided against it. If anyone acted differently, they might notice. Better to keep things normal and look for a way out. That evening, she made a decision. She would request a private meeting with. It was a desperate move, but desperation was all she had left. Maybe if she spoke to him directly, away from the formality of the negotiation chamber, she could find some way to prevent disaster. The request went through several layers of bureaucracy before it was approved. Laura had used an old clause from the original treaty, one that allowed senior military officers to request direct communication with their counterparts. They were slaves to their own rules. They could not refuse without admitting the clause existed. Agreed to meet her in a small observation room on the upper level of the station. When Laura arrived, she found him standing by the window, looking out at the stars. 2 guards stood at the door, their hands resting on their weapons. "You wish to speak privately," General said without turning around. "This is highly irregular." Laura walked to stand beside him. Through the window, she could see a garden area on the lower level of the station, filled with plants from a dozen different worlds. Beyond that, the endless darkness of space stretched in all directions. "So is bringing a war fleet to a diplomatic summit," she said. "I know what you are planning, High Arbiter. I am asking you to reconsider." Finally turned to look at her. His compound eyes reflected her face back at her, broken into hundreds of tiny images. "You know nothing, human. I know that the Empire fears us. That is why you want war now, before humanity becomes too strong to defeat easily. Another 100 years and we might be able to fight back. Another 1,000 years and we might threaten your dominance. You want to destroy us while you still can." The clicking sound came again, harsh and cold. "Fear. We do not fear prey animals, General. We manage them. We control their numbers. Sometimes we must reduce a population that has grown too large." "Then why the urgency? Why not wait another century and let the treaty run its natural course?" Moved closer. He was so tall that Laura had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. In her younger days, she might have stepped backward. Now she held her ground. "Because your species is a disease," he said. "You spread too fast. You adapt too quickly. Your individual lives are nothing, barely a heartbeat compared to ours. But your generations build upon each other like compound interest on a debt. Each generation learns from the last and reaches a little higher. Another century and you will be unmanageable. Another millennium and you might actually threaten the Empire. So this summit is a death sentence for humanity. It is pest control, nothing more." Laura nodded slowly. Part of her had hoped she was wrong, that there was still some chance of peace. That hope was dead now. "I spent my entire life believing peace was possible," she said. "I gave everything I had to maintaining the treaty. 40 years of service. 40 years of swallowing my pride and smiling at creatures who see my people as insects. Your belief was always foolish. Peace between predator and prey is not natural. It is merely a pause between feedings." "Maybe you are right, but I had to try. Someone had to try." She turned and walked toward the door. She had taken 3 steps when spoke again. "You will not leave this station, General. None of your delegation will. The incident has already been arranged." Laura stopped. Her heart was pounding, but her voice stayed steady. "What incident?" She heard movement behind her. When she turned, was holding his ceremonial sidearm. It was a beautiful weapon, covered in gold and jewels, designed to show status rather than to kill. But the energy beam that struck Laura in the chest was very real. The pain was incredible, like fire spreading through her entire body. She fell forward, catching herself on her hands for a moment before collapsing completely. The floor was cold against her cheek. She could smell burning fabric where the beam had hit her uniform. Through dimming vision, she saw standing over her. His voice seemed to come from very far away. "The human general attacked me in a fit of rage," he said, reciting what would become the official story. "I was forced to defend myself. A tragic end to a promising summit. The Empire, of course, will demand compensation for this insult." Laura tried to speak, but no words came out. Her hand moved slowly toward her chest, toward the small pin she wore over her heart. It was a simple thing, a silver star that her husband had given her before he died. She had worn it every day for 20 years. "She is reaching for a weapon," said to his guards. "You will confirm this in your reports." Laura's fingers touched the pin just as the darkness took her. Her last thought was of her granddaughter, Maya, just 4 years old, who had waved goodbye from the spaceport when Laura left for the summit. Laura had promised to bring her something special from the station. She would never get the chance to keep that promise. The High Arbiter looked down at the body of the human general. There was no satisfaction in his compound eyes, no joy in the kill. This was simply business. The Empire had decided that humanity must be controlled and was the instrument of that decision. He activated his communicator. "This is High Arbiter. There has been an incident. The human general has been killed while attempting to attack me. Secure the station immediately. No human is to leave until the investigation is complete." Outside the window, the warships began to move into new positions. The trap was closing. In a few hours, the blockade would be complete. In a few days, the Empire would announce that the Treaty of Rest was void, and then the real killing would begin. Stepped over Laura's body and walked out of the room. He did not look back. She was already forgotten, just another footnote in the long history of conquest. He had no idea what he had just started. The news reached Earth in 12 hours. Every screen on every colony world displayed the same message. General Laura, hero of humanity and senior diplomatic officer, had been killed by High Arbiter at the diplomatic station Horizon's Edge. The official report claimed she had attacked the High Arbiter and been shot in self-defense. The Empire released video footage to support their story. It showed Laura reaching toward her chest, her hand moving quickly, her face twisted in what they called rage. News channels played it on repeat, pointing to the movement as proof that she had been going for a hidden weapon. Human experts examined the footage within hours. They found the truth easily. Laura had been reaching for her chest because she was dying. The object she touched was not a weapon. It was the silver star pin her husband had given her, a small piece of jewelry that meant nothing to anyone except her. She had been trying to hold on to it as her life slipped away. The truth did not matter to they did not need their lie to be believed. They just needed it to exist. As long as there was an official story, the Empire could pretend that everything was proper and legal. The rules had been followed. The paperwork was in order. That was all that mattered to creatures who had built their civilization on bureaucracy. Admiral Hayes received the news on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier standing vigil. He was sitting in his command chair when the message came through, surrounded by officers who had served with him for years. When he read the words on his screen, his face went completely still. He had known Laura for 30 years. They had trained together as young officers, served together on the frontier, and built the secret strength of humanity's military together while they looked the other way. She was one of the few people in the galaxy he truly trusted. Now she was dead, murdered by an alien who saw humans as nothing more than pests to be exterminated. Commander Stone, his second-in-command, approached his chair. She was a tall woman with short dark hair and eyes that never seemed to show emotion, but had known her long enough to see the anger burning beneath her calm surface. "Sir," she said quietly, "the fleet is moving. Long-range sensors show them positioning for a blockade of the Orion transit points. They are cutting off our escape routes. Nodded slowly. He had expected this. The murder was just the beginning. Now the Empire would tighten the noose around humanity's neck, trapping them in their small corner of the galaxy while the war machine prepared for the final assault. "How many ships?" he asked. 12 dreadnoughts, 60 cruisers, about 200 support vessels. It is the largest fleet they have assembled in 3 centuries. Looked at the tactical display floating in front of his chair. The human military was pathetic by comparison. 4 carriers, 20 destroyers, a handful of patrol ships. According to every official record, that was all humanity had. A token force barely capable of defending a single planet, let alone fighting an empire that spanned thousands of star systems. But official records were not the whole story. "Open a secure channel to Echo Station," said. His voice was calm, but every officer on the bridge felt the weight of those words. Echo Station was a name they had all heard whispered in private conversations, a secret that had been passed down through generations of military personnel. Most of them had never been sure if it was real. The communications officer worked at her console for a moment. "Admiral, I have Director on the line." The face that appeared on the main screen belonged to a woman in her 70s. Her hair was iron gray, her eyes were sharp as knives, and her expression suggested she had not smiled in decades. Director had run Echo Station for 40 years, overseeing the most important secret in human history. She said, "I heard about Laura. They murdered her, Sam, shot her in cold blood and called it self-defense. Now they are moving to blockade our space. I know, I have been watching their fleet movement since the summit began." She paused and something shifted in her eyes. "Is this the order?" Closed his eyes. For 500 years, humanity had played the role of the weak and harmless species. They had paid tribute to the Empire. They had bowed their heads and accepted humiliation after humiliation. They had hidden their true strength in shadows and silence, preparing for a day that everyone prayed would never come. That day had arrived. "This is the order," said. "Wake them up, wake them all up." Nodded once. "Understood. Beginning activation sequence now. Full deployment will take 72 hours. "We might not have 72 hours. "Then we will do what we can with what we have. That is what Laura would have wanted." The screen went dark. Sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. What he had just ordered would change everything. There was no going back now. "Commander Stone," he said, "signal the fleet. All ships to battle stations. We move to intercept the blockade in 6 hours." Raised an eyebrow. "Sir, we cannot fight 12 dreadnoughts with 4 carriers." "No, we cannot, but we are not fighting alone." As if on cue, the tactical display began to change. New contacts appeared, emerging from places where no ships should be. They came from asteroid fields and the moons of gas giants. They rose from the ice of frozen worlds and the dust clouds between stars. One by one, then dozens at a time, then hundreds. Ships that had been hidden for centuries. Fleets that had been built in secret, piece by piece, generation by generation. The insurance policy that humanity had spent 500 years preparing. Stared at the display. Her calm exterior finally cracked, replaced by an expression of pure shock. "That is impossible. Where did they all come from?" "From everywhere," said. "From every corner of human space. From places the never thought to look because they were too arrogant to imagine that prey could plan." The numbers on the display kept climbing. 500 ships, 1,000, 2,000. Each one had been built in hidden shipyards disguised as mining platforms or research stations. Each one had been crewed by volunteers who knew they might spend their entire lives waiting for a call that never came. But the call had come, and they were answering. "The Empire thought they were dealing with insects," said quietly. "They forgot that insects build hives. They forgot that insects work together. They forgot that when you threaten the hive, every single insect will fight to protect it. He stood up from his chair and looked around the bridge at his officers. They were all staring at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Laura gave her life for peace," he said. "The spat on that sacrifice. They think they can destroy us because they are bigger and older and stronger, but they forgot something important about humans." He turned to face the tactical display, watching the flood of green dots that represented humanity's hidden strength. "We never forget, we never forgive, and we never ever give up." The bridge erupted in cheers. For the first time in 500 years, humanity was no longer pretending to be weak. The mask had fallen away. The truth was revealed. And they were about to learn what that truth meant. High Arbiter expected humanity to surrender within days. Their official fleet was laughable. Their colonies were scattered across a small corner of the galaxy with no real defenses. Once the blockade was complete, the humans would have no choice but to accept whatever terms the Empire demanded. More tribute, more restrictions, perhaps even the surrender of their entire species into permanent servitude. That was how things were supposed to happen. That was how things had always happened when they decided to crush a lesser species. But something strange began to occur on the second day after the blockade was established. Human civilian ships started disappearing from normal shipping lanes. At first, commanders assumed they were fleeing toward the interior of human space, trying to escape the coming war. Frightened prey running from predators. Nothing unusual. Then the reports started coming in from the border systems. Ships were appearing in places where no ships should be. They emerged from asteroid fields that had been surveyed and declared empty. They rose from the frozen moons of distant gas giants. They materialized from the dark spaces between stars, from regions where sensors showed nothing but cold vacuum. Not dozens of ships, thousands of them. Studied the intelligence reports in his private chamber aboard the station. His compound eyes moved across the data, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The numbers did not add up. The humans could not have built this many ships. It was simply impossible. "Where did they come from?" he demanded. His military advisor, Subcommander Hose, stood nearby with his head bowed in the posture of a subordinate delivering bad news. "We do not know, High Arbiter. They appear to have been hidden, stored in secret locations. Some of these ship designs are centuries old." "Hidden where?" "We have monitored their shipyards since the treaty was signed. We have inspected their military facilities every decade. They could not have built all of this without our knowledge." "They did not build in their official shipyards," Hose said carefully. "These ships were constructed elsewhere, in places we never thought to look." The scope of the deception became clear over the following hours. Humanity had spent 500 years building in secret. Factory ships disguised as mining platforms had produced weapons and hull plates in the depths of asteroid belts. Training facilities had been buried beneath the ice of frozen moons, where sensors could not penetrate. Supply caches had been hidden in hollowed-out comets, drifting through the darkness until they were needed. All of it invisible to the Empire because they had never imagined that prey could be so patient. They lived for thousands of years and thought in terms of centuries. Humans lived barely a single century each, yet they had maintained a conspiracy across generations, passing secrets from parent to child, building toward a future they might never see. It was impossible, and yet it was happening. The ships themselves were even more disturbing. They were not the crude, simple vessels that humanity was known for. These were sleek and advanced, covered in systems that they had believed were beyond human capability. Their weapons were more powerful than they should be. Their shields were stronger. Their engines were faster. "They have been studying our technology," Hose said, fear creeping into his voice for the first time. "The tribute payments. Every year, we sent them samples of our equipment as part of the cultural exchange program. We thought it was a gesture of superiority, showing them what they could never achieve." They were learning from it, finished, reverse engineering everything we gave them. Yes, High Arbiter, and they did not just copy our technology, they improved it. Some of these ships have systems that our engineers do not recognize. Felt something he had not experienced in centuries. It took him a moment to identify the emotion. Fear. He was feeling fear. The first real engagement happened near the transit point, one of the main routes between human space and the rest of the galaxy. A cruiser squadron of 15 ships moved to intercept what they believed was a group of fleeing refugee transports. Easy prey, a simple demonstration of imperial power. Instead of refugees, they found the destroyer fleet called Rising Tide. 500 human warships that had been hiding behind a field of debris, waiting in perfect silence for their moment to strike. They had powered down all systems, running on nothing but battery reserves, invisible to every sensor they possessed. When they powered up and opened fire, the cruiser squadron had no chance to respond. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Every ship was destroyed. There were no survivors. News of the defeat spread through the Imperial fleet like poison. Commanders who had spent their careers believing in superiority suddenly found themselves questioning everything. If the humans could hide 500 ships in a debris field, what else were they hiding? If they could destroy a cruiser squadron in 11 minutes, what could they do to a dreadnought? Ordered the blockade fleet to hold position while he demanded reinforcements from the Empire. But reinforcements would take weeks to arrive. The nearest major Imperial fleet was on the other side of space, and faster-than-light travel still took time, even for the masters of the galaxy. Meanwhile, the human fleet kept growing. Every hour, more ships appeared on sensors. They came from every direction, converging on the Orion transit points like streams flowing toward an ocean. The original estimate of 3,000 ships was quickly revised upward. 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. Admiral Hayes watched the numbers climb from the bridge of the Standing Vigil. His fleet had grown from 4 carriers to 40 in the span of 3 days. More were arriving constantly, ships crewed by men and women who had spent their entire lives training for this moment. Commander Stone stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. "The blockade fleet is holding position," she reported. "They are not advancing. I think we scared them." "Good," said. "Fear is the first step toward defeat." "Sir, we have received a message from Director at Echo Station. Full deployment is complete. All hidden assets are now active." Allowed himself a small smile. "How many ships do we have in total?" Checked her. 14,000 combat vessels, plus supply ships, repair stations, and medical transports. It is the largest fleet humanity has ever assembled. And the thought we had 4 carriers and 20 destroyers. They thought wrong. Turned to face the main, which showed a real-time image of the blockade fleet. 12 dreadnoughts hung in the void like metal mountains, surrounded by swarms of smaller cruisers and support ships. They were still dangerous. They were still capable of immense destruction. But they were no longer invincible. "Open a channel to all human ships," said. "I want to address the fleet." The communications officer worked at her console. "Channel open, Admiral. All ships are listening." Took a deep breath. Somewhere out there, 14,000 crews were waiting to hear what he had to say. Men and women who had trained in secret, served in shadows, and kept faith with a promise made by their ancestors 5 centuries ago. "This is Admiral Hayes," he began. 3 days ago, the Empire murdered General Laura. They shot her in cold blood and called it self-defense. They thought her death would be the beginning of our end. They were wrong." He paused, letting the words sink in. "For 500 years, we have played the role of the weak and harmless species. We bowed our heads. We paid tribute. We smiled while they insulted us and pretended we were not watching, not learning, not preparing. That time is over. The mask is off. The truth is revealed." He pointed at the image of the fleet on the Those ships represent everything the Empire believes about us. That we are prey, that we are insects, that we exist only because they allow us to exist. Today, we are going to show them how wrong they are. In 6 hours, we will attack the blockade. We will break their fleet. We will open the transit points. And we will show the entire galaxy that humanity is not prey. We are not insects. We are the species that turns weakness into strength, that transforms fear into fury, that never stops fighting until the fight is won. He straightened his shoulders and spoke the final words with quiet conviction. For Laura, for Earth, for humanity, let us begin. Across 14,000 ships, crews cheered and prepared for battle. The largest war in galactic history was about to begin. The Battle of Orion's Gate became the largest naval engagement in the history of the galaxy. For 8,000 years, the had conquered world after world, crushing every species that dared to resist them. They had developed strategies and tactics that had never failed. Their dreadnoughts were considered invincible, their commanders the finest in existence. None of that mattered when the human fleet arrived. They came from 13 different directions at once, surrounding the formation like wolves circling wounded prey. The movement was perfectly coordinated, each ship knowing exactly where to go and what to do. There was no confusion, no hesitation, no fear. 500 years of preparation had created a military machine unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The human flagship, the carrier Unity, led the main assault. It was an enormous vessel, bigger than anything humanity had officially been allowed to build, its hull covered in weapons that they had never encountered before. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge, surrounded by officers who had trained their entire lives for this moment. All ships begin attack run, he ordered. Focus fire on the dreadnought Eternal Wrath. Destroyer wings 7 through 12 execute pincer movement. Carrier group launch all fighters. The Eternal Wrath was the pride of the fleet, a ship that had crushed rebellions across 1,000 worlds. Its commander, High Admiral, was considered one of the greatest military minds in the Empire. He had never lost a battle. He had never even come close to losing. The battle lasted 43 minutes. When it ended, the Eternal Wrath was nothing but debris spreading slowly through the void. Had tried everything. He had used tactics that had worked against every other species. He had maneuvered, adapted, improvised. But the humans were always one step ahead. They anticipated his moves before he made them. They exploited weaknesses he did not know he had. They fought with a fury and precision that seemed almost impossible. The truth was simple but terrifying. For 500 years, humanity had studied They had learned everything about imperial tactics, imperial technology, imperial thinking. They had run simulations and war games in secret facilities buried beneath frozen moons. They had prepared for every scenario, every possibility, every trick the Empire might use. The meanwhile had learned nothing about humanity. They had been too arrogant to study prey. One by one, the dreadnoughts fell. The crushing fist was destroyed by a coordinated attack from 200 human destroyers. The Eternal Glory was torn apart when human ships detonated its own ammunition magazines. The Divine Wrath was captured intact when human marines boarded it and took control of the bridge. By the time the battle ended, 8 dreadnoughts had been destroyed. 2 more had been captured. The remaining 2 fled into hyperspace, carrying with them the terrible news of what had happened. The blockade was broken. The Orion transit points were open, and humanity was no longer the weak and harmless species that the Empire had believed them to be. On Horizon's edge, High Arbiter watched the reports coming in with growing horror. His great plan, the reassertion of dominance, had collapsed in a single day. The fleet he had assembled to crush humanity had itself been crushed. "How is this possible?" he demanded, his voice rising to something that might have been panic. "They were weak. They were nothing. They were prey." His advisor said nothing. There was nothing left to say. 3 days after the battle, human Marines boarded the diplomatic station. They moved through the corridors with professional efficiency, securing each section before moving to the next. They were not cruel. They were not violent beyond necessity. They simply did their job with the calm competence of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Commander Stone led the team that found. He was in his private quarters, trying to destroy his communication logs before they could be captured. When the door opened, he turned to face the humans with what remained of his dignity. "High Arbiter," said, her voice flat and cold, "you are being detained for war crimes, including the murder of General Laura." "This is outrageous," replied. "I am a diplomatic representative of the Galactic Empire. I have immunity under the treaty." "The treaty you voided when you murdered our general. That treaty," shook her head. "Your diplomatic immunity is no longer recognized. You will be transported to Earth to stand trial." "The Empire will never allow this. They will send fleets to rescue me. They will burn your worlds to ash." Allowed herself a small, cold smile. They already tried. It did not go well for them. The war continued for another year, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Humanity pushed outward from the Orion Arm, liberating system after system from control. Other species, long oppressed by the Empire, saw what was happening and began to rise up as well. The great edifice that had stood for 8,000 years was crumbling, and humanity was the hammer that had struck the first blow. Finally, the ruling council requested peace talks. They had no choice. Their fleets were broken, their economy was collapsing, and rebellion was spreading across their territory like wildfire. The mighty empire that had terrorized the galaxy was on the edge of complete collapse. The Treaty of New Earth was signed in the same chamber where Laura had tried to negotiate peace 1 year earlier. But this time, humanity was not the supplicant. This time, humanity dictated the terms. No more tribute payments. No more restrictions on human expansion. Free access to all trade routes and transit points. The establishment of a new galactic council where every species would have an equal voice, including humanity. Some people argued for harsher terms. They wanted revenge for 5 centuries of humiliation. They wanted to destroy the empire completely, to reduce to the same status that humanity had endured for so long. Admiral Hayes, now promoted to Fleet Admiral and the senior military commander of human forces, rejected those calls. "General spent her life working for peace," he said at the signing ceremony. His voice was tired but steady, the voice of a man who had seen too much death and wanted no more. She believed that humans could be better than our enemies. She believed that strength should be used to protect, not to dominate. We honor her memory not by becoming what we defeated, but by building something new, something worthy of her sacrifice. A statue of Laura was erected at the entrance to the new council chambers. It showed her as she had been in life, standing straight and proud in her uniform, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes looking toward the future. The plaque beneath it read simple words that carried the weight of everything humanity had fought for. She gave her life believing in peace. We built a peace worthy of her belief. High Arbiter was tried and convicted of murder. He spent the rest of his long life in a human prison, surrounded by guards who treated him with strict professionalism but no warmth. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered how everything had gone so wrong. He had been so certain that humanity would fall. He had been so confident in the superiority of his species. He never understood his mistake. He never grasped that the true strength of humanity was not in their ships or their weapons. It was in their ability to work together, to sacrifice for future generations, to hold onto hope even in the darkest times. It was in their refusal to give up, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. They had ruled through fear and force. They had crushed opposition and demanded obedience. It had worked for 8,000 years, but it had also planted seeds of hatred in every species they conquered. Humanity offered something different, partnership instead of domination, cooperation instead of control, the chance to build a future together rather than serve as slaves to a master race. Across the galaxy, among the hundreds of species that had lived under the boot, a new phrase entered the common tongue. It was spoken in quiet awe, in hopeful whispers, in the dawning recognition that the universe had changed forever. They called it the human way. It was not conquest. It was not the cruel mathematics of power that the old empires had practiced for. It was something new, something different, something that gave hope to species who had forgotten what hope felt like. Laura never lived to see it. She died alone on the floor of a diplomatic station, murdered by a creature who saw her as nothing more than an insect to be crushed. But her belief, her faith in what humanity could become, lived on in every ship that fought for freedom and every treaty that promised a better future. She had been right all along. Peace was possible, not the false peace of submission, but the true peace of equals working together. It just took a war to prove it. And in the end, that was the most human thing of all, turning tragedy into triumph, transforming death into new life, finding hope in the darkest places and carrying it forward into the light. The galaxy would never be the same, and somewhere, somehow, Laura was smiling,